Hey guys, in this video we're going to look at S posture in the golf swing or golf address position, popularised by the Titleist Performance Institute, so it's on their website. So we're going to look at what they suggest and maybe how we could improve S posture if you have it, and really just touch on a few things that maybe I don't necessarily agree with what TPI suggests, but also things that I do. Here we go. So looking at what they call the swing body connection, they suggest S posture is created by having too much arch in the lower back and can be a result of sticking your tailbone out too far or having a lower crossed syndrome. Muscle imbalances around the core area. S posture causes are as follows. So they suggest lower cross syndrome, the student doesn't know how to bend from the hips, student has been told to stick their butt out, lack of abdominal strength and relaxing of abdominal musculature, and too much flex in the knees. Okay, so we're gonna have a look at these and see if it makes sense and see if any relate to you. How much is too much and how much is okay? Okay, there's got to be a range. Okay, we don't need to necessarily have a exact perfect position. If we're a few degrees forwards or backwards, then surely that's okay. So really, when we're talking about S posture, we're saying, okay, an excessive anterior pelvic tilt maybe isn't good. So reading through what TPI suggests about S posture, they say things like abnormally high stress on the lower back and deactivation of core muscles, leading to a reverse spine angle as well. Not that we're really looking at pain associated today with that lordotic anterior pelvic tilt position. In this study, only found a moderate, kind of weak correlation between hanging out in that position and lower back pain on a pain score. And that was for standing for a couple of hours. If we go into posture and out of posture, then surely there's going to be less chance of pain. However, maybe if we're also rotating, flexing, lateral flexing with it, then maybe that increases the chances. However, again, we're not really going into too much detail of lower back pain today. Let's assume that, okay, we have S posture, that you're then going to lead to a reverse spine angle, which kind of makes sense, okay? So if we look at the movement around the hips, we want trail hip internal rotation during the backswing. But if our pelvis is in the wrong position, we now limit that internal rotation. So if we can't load into that trail leg, maybe we have to tip backwards, or if we're already extended, if we just rotate, then it's going to be a slight reverse spine angle anyway, so that makes sense. Getting from that reverse spine angle then back into a good position to hit the ball then requires more moving parts, maybe less efficient. It goes from that extension, flexion, extension, maybe into that reverse C finish posture as well. So extension, flexion, extension, plus rotation and lateral flexion. Maybe that's a bit too much. So this study here suggests that pelvic tilt affects the way the hip moves, and particularly important for the golf swing, maybe into internal and external rotation, okay, and pelvic tilt position does seem to affect internal rotation, okay, so if we're anteriorly pelvic tilted, we can't really load into that backside trail leg, okay, unless we're changing that pelvic tilt whilst we turn. So low cross syndrome suggests that we have sort of tight hip flexors and lower back, and then which inhibits the glutes and abdominals. This pulls us into a sort of anterior pelvic tilt, okay, pelvis forwards, tipped forwards position. However, in the golf position, that means that our hip flexors surely aren't going to be as tight because we're flexed forwards. So now tight hip flexors surely aren't going to put us into even more of a, or keep us in that anterior pelvic tilt position, unless we're just used to having that anterior pelvic tilt. So it doesn't quite add up for me. So if we are in that anterior pelvic tilt, if the lower back muscles are active, the lower cross syndrome suggests that the front anterior core would have to relax, okay, so it's reciprocal inhibition. So if I tense my bicep, this means the tricep has to relax, okay, and vice versa, okay, which makes sense. However, if this is a passive move, okay, it's not actively trying to get these lower back muscles to activate, okay, because if I just arch my back, I can brace my abs, okay? They haven't switched off. They can't switch off. Have they become compromised in some way? Okay, has it affected their ability to function? Okay, in that stretched position, so if we're in a reverse spine angle, okay, and let's say the abdominals are stretched, are lengthened, then it's a harder position for them to contract in, okay, fine. And if the lower back is more active, male dominant, and this is maybe inhibiting the abdominals, rectus abdominis, maybe, from activating, then is this really a problem? Because really we start the downswing with the hips, and so then if the hips are leading, it's really the hip musculature that's going first, and then once we're back into this position here, then it's the trunk musculature. And so really the trunk or the abdominal obliques are active or most active during the acceleration phase of the golf swing, as shown by this study here. So these studies here suggest that the abdominals, that there's no relationship between abdominal strength and anterior pelvic tilt, and strengthening the abdominals doesn't seem to change anterior pelvic tilt. So that kind of brings us back to what I'm suggesting, is that it's actually the posterior chain, so it's lower back, glutes, hamstrings that we really need to be focusing on. I don't necessarily agree with the premise that firstly anterior pelvic tilt is going to inhibit the glutes from working. Maybe it's going to make it a little bit harder, but also then evidence suggests that they can still work just as good as if hip flexors weren't tight, but in the golf swing then we're flexed, so then surely they're not going to be tight to begin with. And if we just naturally kind of passively get into that S posture rather than actively trying to get the lower back muscles working, then the lower back won't necessarily have as much stress on it compared to if it was an actively anterior pelvic tilt position. So this study here suggests that there's no difference in glute max activation for those with limited hip flexor range of motion, okay, so tight hip flexors or not, okay. However, if they did have tight hip flexors, then they use their glutes less during a squat. So maybe in a dynamic movement such as like a squat or maybe a golf swing, they don't use their glutes as much. However, less glute activation could have just meant that they were stronger and they didn't need to use their glutes as much. It's not really strong evidence for or against that glutes are inhibited. So I still have a problem with the premise of the lower cross syndrome having tight hip flexors in that sort of forward flex position, meaning that the posterior chain's inhibited, whereas I really just think it's probably just a weak posterior chain, okay, maybe lower back, glutes, hamstrings. So let's assume that you have S posture. Okay, maybe it's because the lower back is weak. It's going to get tired, which could lead to possibly injury if it's weak. So how about strengthening the lower back or the whole posterior chain? So lower back, glutes, hamstrings area. So things like deadlifts, squats, bent over rows, single arm rows, good mornings. So it comes back to how much anterior pelvic tilt, okay? And I think if it's a passive or active move, if you actively try and pull yourself into that position and get those muscles working harder, of course they're going to get tired, they're going to get fatigued, and maybe over time, overuse or too much use. But again, we're getting down the pain side of things, where which is kind of beyond the scope of this video. And the trouble may be made worse if we're focusing on the anterior core strength and neglecting posterior core. As in this study, it shows that those golfers with lower back pain generally were weaker in the lower back, in the sort of trunk extension test, okay? But they were also kind of just generally weaker in all tests that were measured between those with lower back pain and those golfers without lower back pain. So I think my number one cause is that it's just not knowing how to set up, not knowing where your spine is and pelvis is in space. So we need to hip hinge, we need to control our pelvis, okay? So things like, simple things to begin with, like can you hip hinge, club down your back, keep in that sort of neutral spine posture. Can you do it? A good one is bum to wall drill, hip hinge. Can you control the pelvis in things like a plank or a dead bug position? If you find you have limited range of motion around the hips, such as tight hip flexors, then sure, you can do exercises to strengthen them as well. Okay, whether it affects S posture, then that's the thing that I'm not entirely sure about. Okay, I don't think so as much as strengthening the posterior chain, so weak posterior chain leading to S posture after the main cause of just not knowing what you should be doing or where your body is in that setup position. So anyway, here's some exercises. Thanks for watching this video, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And next up, we're going to do C posture.